a short stack in poker tournaments. We are going to be going through and explaining how to play all the common spots from a fundamentally sound, game theory optimal point of view. You have to understand that throughout a tournament, it is quite common for the eventual winner of the tournament to not just be the chip leader throughout the entire tournament. I realize that happens sometimes, but usually it doesn't work out that way. Quite often, the chip leader's going to lose some all ends, and they are going to get down to a medium or even a short stack. So you have to make sure that you know how to play that stack depth well. Whenever you're playing short stack, it's very, very easy to feel as if your back is against the wall and you're being pushed around by all the big stacks. But regardless of how many big blinds you have, as long as you have poise and patience and you understand how to play fundamentally sound poker while also adjusting to whatever your opponent's doing correctly, you're going to be in pretty good shape. Also, this show is called Little Brain Fuel. You want to make sure that even when things are going poorly, you're thinking very, very well. You can use code Poker Coaching to get, I think it's 15% off Brain Fuel. I drink it pretty much every day, and it lets me focus throughout the day, which is very important when you are playing poker. So, first things first. When you're playing, let's say, 15 big blinds deep, which is what you're going to be discussing, you want to make sure that you very, very clearly start from good, strong, fundamentally sound ranges. You want to use good ranges. So we have charts at pokercoaching.com. You can actually get some of these charts completely for free at pokercoaching.com/15bb charts. We're going to be going through 15 big blind simulations here today. Now, if we were to be, let's say, 20 big blinds deep, we have 20 big blind charts, we have 25 big blind charts, we have 30 big blind charts, we have 12 big blind charts. Make sure you use the chart for the situation that you are in. All of these charts are available complimentary to Poker Coaching Premium members. So, if you're a Poker Coaching Premium member, get in there and use the charts. They're also available in the Poker Coaching app, which is another completely free resource or included resource for Poker Coaching members. All right, 15 big blinds. Under the gun, raise first in. What does this mean? This is the default range and default strategy you're going to want to use from first position playing 8-handed in a poker tournament, assuming there's an ante in play, a big blind ante, also assuming there are no payout implications currently looming. I realize that late in tournaments, there will very often be some or gigantic payout implications, and in that case, you cannot very clearly follow these charts. But if you studied the tournament masterclass at pokercoaching.com and a lot of the content by the other coaches, you will know that you'll roughly know how to go about adjusting. Essentially, ace-x goes up in value, suited connectors, small pairs go down in value whenever you are in those scenarios with payout implications. So, now that we know what we're discussing, big blind ante in play, and no payout implications, this is what you should do whenever you are under the gun. If you do not do this, and your opponents all play well, you're going to lose money. And I don't want you to lose money. I want you all to win money. You all are here with me today to make sure you are playing good, strong, fundamentally sound strategies. Okay? Also, if you're a Poker Coaching member, get out your Poker Coaching app. Can you see it? Get out your Poker Coaching app. Oh my God, it logged me out. Well, whatever. I'm not going to log in right now. You log in and go through the charts as I'm doing it, so you can go through and learn to quickly navigate these charts in real time. Now, obviously, you don't want to have this out when you're actually at the table playing, but you know, if it's not against the rules of the site to look up the casino to look up a spot before the hand happens, I don't have a problem with it. Now, some people view that as lame, but as long as you are playing within the rules of the site that you are playing, you're doing nothing wrong. So keep that in mind. All right, so take a look. First things you'll notice: 5s, 4s, 3s, and 2s, all just open fold. 15 big blinds deep under the gun. 8-handed. A lot of people think that with these hands, you just want to shove it all in because they're probably the best hand. Is 2s on there? Yeah, 2s is on there. But it turns out if you're open shoving these hands, you'll see all the hands at the bottom are just folds. If you're shoving these hands, you're making a big blunder. Notice 15 big blinds deep, you actually don't do a whole lot of open shoving in general from early position, any of the early positions. Notice here the all-in range is the dark red range, and the light red range is a minimum raise range. Okay, so you're min raising all the hands in light red, shoving the hands in dark red for simplicity. Given this is 0.5% of all hands and the raising range is 15% of all hands, I would recommend just not having a shoving range for simplicity. And that will not change your range here much at all. So notice small pairs fold. Also notice hands like King 8 suited, King 9 suited. These hands get played. A lot of players, myself included for a long time, did not play hands from early position like King X suited, especially like King 8 suited. Turns out King 8 suited is actually a pretty good hand. You may notice that some of these hands are only raising, let's say, 71% of the time, like King 8 suited. By the way, if you are listening to this on the audio podcast, hello, welcome. But also, get out the charts and follow along, please, so this will make a whole lot more sense. So notice King 8 suited is raising 71% of the time. That means you should raise it 71% of the time and fold it the other 29% of the time. But how do you do that in game? I would essentially recommend any hand that is raising more than roughly 50%, you just raise it every time. Any hand that's raising less than 50%, you either fold it every time or also raise it every time. And you may realize that that will result in you raising a little bit more than the Gto strategy recommends. And I think that is actually good. Why? Because most people fold a little bit too often. If most people fold a little bit too often, or they don't 3-bet you quite often enough, your logical adjustment should be to raise more. Simple as that. So, in this situation, I would almost certainly be raising like any ace-x suited. I think the ace-x's are quite good hands to raise because they block your opponent's shoving and calling ranges. And I would also raise pretty much every hand that is raising any percentage of the time. Like we see Jack 9 suited raising 24% of the time, I would just raise it. And yeah, you're going to be exploitable against shoves or re-raises, but I think that's going to be fine. It's also worth noting, this chart, this 15 big blind chart, presumes everyone has 15 big blinds. Now, if somebody has 12 behind you, and somebody has 100 behind you, and somebody has 40 behind you, the charts will start to get a little bit convoluted. For example, say you min raise under the gun, and under the gun +1 has 40 big blinds, and everybody else has 100. Well, that 40 big blind stack can't just rip it in for 40 big blinds, right? Which means they're going to be playing a different strategy than the under the gun +1 versus under the gun raise range if everybody has 15 big blinds. So you always want to account for all the various stacks in play. We could make charts for all of these spots, but there are a billion of them. And for that reason, we're going to recommend you use logic, okay? But the nice thing about having this 15 big blind stack is that quite often you are one of the shallower stacks at the table, if not the shallowest. And that allows you to kind of closely follow the charts. It gets a little bit different if you're playing like 40 big blinds deep and then there's a 20 big blind stack and a 100 big blind stack and they're all yet to act and the positions matter. It gets a little bit rough. So anyway, this is what you should be raising under the gun. If you're raising wider than this, like much wider than this, you're probably making an error. If you're raising tighter than this, you're almost certainly making an error. Realize this is only about 15.6% of hands, which is not a lot. Some people think that they should only be min raising with the absolute best hands in this scenario, like 9s and better, ace jack and better, and then just calling it off every time, thinking, oh, well, I'm obviously going to get action. Now, if your opponents are actually insane, loose, splashy players, you got to realize hands like ace 5 suited and hands like king jack offsuit become value bets to some extent, right? And just because someone gives you action doesn't mean it's bad, obviously, when there's no payout implications. Now, when there's payout implications, you will use a different strategy. And with 15 big blinds, with payout implications, you'll do more shoving than you will min raising because you really don't want to min raise and then fold. Whereas here, if you min raise a hand like ace jack suited and somebody shoves, you just happily call it off. But with payout implications, that's not quite as good of a play. So you'll see more shoves with hands in this vicinity, the good, strong suited hands, and like the ace king, ace queen, ace jack, king queen type stuff. All right, if you're the chip leader with 100 big blinds and others are at 15, should you be viewing the 15 big blind ranges if you're not playing exploitatively? Well, you just have to realize that they are playing 15 big blind strategies. And if you have 100 and they all have 15, then you're just playing 15 big blind poker, right? But the thing is if you have 100 and some people have 15, some people are often going to have like 50 or 40, right? So imagine a 15 big blind stack min raises under the gun. You can't just look at the Gto strategy 15 big blinds deep and use it because if you, let's say, find an easy all-in, which usually you're going to be shoving or folding, that doesn't work if there's like another 100 big blind stack you have to act, because it would never go minimum to 2, you make it 100, because then you just get crushed by the 100 big blind stack you have to act. So you're going to instead have a small 3-bet range instead of a shove range in those spots. Mixon says that the studying's been helping a lot. Well, thank you. I'm glad to hear it. If you all enjoyed the show, give me a Like and subscribe below. I would appreciate it. Costs you nothing and helps the channel a lot. For 50% frequencies, you pick a suit and a color. Yeah, I just raised them all. How do you manage a short stack? That's what we're talking about today. Hello, hello. Welcome. My name is Jonathan Lowe. We're going to be discussing exactly what the title says today. All right. This is the under the gun range. What about under the gun +1? This will be under the gun if we were 7-handed. We're going to raise slightly wider and shove a little bit more often. Notice now we are raising 17.5% of hands instead of 16.1, 16.6, something like that. Also, notice we're shoving a lot more. So instead of shoving 0.5% of the hands, we're shoving 2.2% of the hands. So now I probably would start using a shoving range. Some people ask, by the way, what if you're playing like 10-handed? Well, look at this under the gun range and then raise tighter. So you would just like cut off the bottom. All the hands that are using mixed frequencies right now, just get rid of all those and you'll probably be fine. And don't shove anything. All right, under the gun +1. A little bit more shoves. You'll find that the shoves very often come from the ace, king, ace, queen, ace, jack type hands and king, queen. Notice they're all shoving some. But then also hands like king, jack suited, king 10 suited, queen, jack suited, jack 10 suited. You'll see this range get a little bit wider and wider in terms of shoves as you get in later and later position. Also, the small pairs start to shove a little bit more. So now we see 7s and 6s shoving 33-ish% of the time each, whereas before they were min-raising the vast majority of the time. Okay, so not a whole lot changes, but we do see some very clear changes. From the low jack seat, we're going to see more shoves. Okay, so now we see 7s, 6s, and 5s. 5s has crept in here, shoving the majority of the time. Lots more of these big but non-premium suited connectors. Queen 10 suited, jack 10 suited, king 10 suited, ace 9 suited, ace 8 suited, all open shoving from the low jack seat. Low jack seat would be first to act 6-handed. Then we see ace queen, king queen, and ace jack shoving almost every time. Open shoving for 15 big blinds. You just say you're all in. Okay? Why does king 10 have a wider shoving range than king jack suited? Okay, so in the previous chart, why does king 10 suited shove more than king jack suited? Because king jack suited is good enough to min raise and call it off. We're going to go through what happens when you raise and someone shoves on you in a minute. But essentially, any of the hands that are on top of these hands that are better than like jack 10 suited and queen jack suited, any hands up here are going to min raise and call it off. Any hands below are going to min raise and fold. So essentially, king jack suited is good enough to min raise and call it off. If we look at the next chart from the low jack seat, we'll see that range changes a little bit. Essentially, you're shoving a little bit wider, which means you need to shove slightly better hands and you get to shove some slightly weaker hands. But like right here, queen 10 suited is probably raising and calling it off still, which is pretty gross. But the hands on the bottom are going to be raising and folding. It's like, why does ace king suited not shove? Because it's good enough to min raise and see the flop and have good post flop playability. Do you play tighter or looser when other players have deeper stacks? Well, it depends on their tendencies, right? If they play well, you should be using roughly these 15 big blind charts. Because at the end of the day, the effective stack is the one that matters the most by a mile. So if the effective stack, your stack here, is 15 big blinds, everybody else has 100, they're probably they're going to have to make suboptimal plays against you to account for all the other players. So you can usually just play roughly the same range. And like I said, I usually play a touch wider than GTO recommends because most people do not call enough or 3-bet enough, and they fold a little bit too much. What do the little O's mean? Little O's mean offsuit. The hands, okay, so here I have a diagonally across. We have pocket pairs. We have 2s all the way up to pocket aces. On the top right-hand side of the screen, this giant triangle, these are all suited hands. Bottom left triangle of the screen, these are all offsuit hands. You play more suited hands than offsuit hands because suited hands are better. How do you adjust your range when facing limpers? Well, you adjust, obviously. The thing is that if you look at the game theory optimal range from under the gun +1, or from under the gun, you see under the gun literally never limps. That means when under the gun limps, and then you are next to act, they screwed up. If they screwed up, it means the GTO strategy no longer applies. Now, the question becomes, will they fold too often or call too often? If they will fold too often because they're limping stuff like jack 8 suited, then you in turn should actually shove a little bit wider. Also, you should definitely be shoving over the limpers more often than you would if there was no limper because there's a little bit more money in the pot. Okay? So I'm not doing a whole lot of small raising except with my absolute best hands. Just because I do expect if they limp, they're not really planning to limp and then fold, right? So you want to be raising with all the best hands, like maybe, I don't know, tens and better, ace jack suited and better, king queen suited, ace king, ace queen, and then shoving a lot of the other stuff. You may opt to limp behind with some hands, like king nine suited. That could be fine. I mean, again, I don't know. Depends on the opponent's strategies. That said, I don't hate shoving more than GTO would recommend. It's almost like you're playing with just a 12 big blind stack, right? Imagine you're playing 12 big blind stack and you think you have a lot of fold equity. Notice here now, like king nine suited shoves, 10-9 suited shoves, so all the small pairs shove. Notice again, like I said, roughly tens and better, ace jack suited and better. I said ace king and ace queen, offsuit even, but whatever, those hands shove. But those all are the hands that still raise small because they're just so good. So this is more of what I would do if I was facing a limper, and I would not be using many of these small 3-bets. I'd probably either fold or limp behind, but I'm really only raising small with the best hands in that spot. Unless I think they're going to fold a lot for a small raise, which most people don't. Would a player who plays perfectly pre-flop but poorly post-flop be able to beat the small stakes? Depends on how deep the stacks are, right? All right, so this is under the gun +1. We looked at low jack. Now let's look at hijack. Now the hijack is going to start playing a much wider range, okay? Notice, as we get in later position, we min raise with a wider range of good hands. Okay, so notice before, when we were, let's say, even in the low jack seat, we are raising with roughly 7s and better for value in terms of the pairs. But now in the hijack seat, we're raising like maybe 6s and better we can justify raising. So the range that we can min raise for value and call it off with goes down just a little bit. And that's going to happen across the board. Like if we look at under the gun +1, you see, well, it's not a good example because there's shoves, but you see there like 7s is shoving some, whereas when we look in the hijack seat, 7s is going to be shoving almost none because 7s is not good enough to shove. Same thing happens with all the other hands. Essentially, they all get pushed down a little bit to where, like you see, ace king offsuit is now min raising and calling it off from the hijack seat, whereas under the gun +1 it was shoving sometimes, right? And from the low jack it was shoving a little bit. From under the gun it was shoving a little bit, but now, like I said, in the hijack it's going to be raising or shoving almost none and raising every time. That's kind of a consistent pattern you see. I know we're looking at we're looking at very close spots, so it's kind of tough to see big differences, but it is a difference. And you can extrapolate and realize that essentially you raise with a wider range of hands that can call off against a shove, and that allows you to raise with a wider range of junk. And the hands in the middle of the raise and easy call-offs and the raise and easy folds, those hands often opt to shove. So see now like jack 10 suited, 10-9 suited, queen 10 suited, king 10 suited, king queen offsuit, ace 9 offsuit, ace 5 suited. These are hands that really don't want to min raise and then fold to a shove when you raise in the hijack seat. So you open shove them instead. Simple as that. From the cutoff seat, you'll see that this continues to happen. Now, I guess I should make this a little bit smaller, huh? I want to make sure you all can see it, but at the same time, I want to get it on the screen. Let me know if this is better or the other one's better. I want to be able to get the pocket twos on the screen. Okay, so here we see now all the small pairs are shoving from the cutoff. A lot of the ace-x offsuit is shoving. A lot of the low ace-x suited is shoving, right? And a lot of the big offsuit hands are shoving now too, like king, queen, king, jack, and queen jack. Are just open shoving, 15 big blinds from the cutoff. From the button, it's going to be even wider, right? Even wider. Jack 10 offsuit shoving, queen 10 offsuit shoving. You'll see a lot of these offsuit hands really want to shove. All the ace-x offsuit shoves for the most part besides ace king now and some ace queen. Remember I said like the hands at the top will start to get pushed down a little bit more as you get in later position. Now ace queen does not shove every time. It min raises about half the time because it's good enough. But hands like queen jack, king 10, king queen, these offsuit hands really just want to open shove because they're probably the best hand. They don't mind winning the pot. And if you min raise and get called, you're not going to flop well enough post-flop to justify continuing. And you'll see what GTO usually does is it mixes these open shoves with hands like king queen with 100% min raises from king queen suited. You're going to find that a lot of these hands that are open shoving as big offsuit hands are min raising as big suited hands. And then some of the hands that are min raising and folding as big offsuit hands like king 9, queen 9, jack 9, 10 9, king 8, hands in this vicinity, these hands are min raising and folding, whereas these hands over here that are suited are now open shoving. So you'll see that this pattern usually holds true, where the hands that min raise and call off that are good enough to do that as suited hands are often open shoving as offsuit hands, et cetera, et cetera. You get what I'm saying, right? If you look at king, queen, one's min raising, one's shoving. You look at king, jack, one's min raising, one's shoving. That's not perfectly coordinated, but it is often kind of similar. As Louis Philippe here says, official poker coaching study group. Make sure you get in our poker coaching study group. They study a lot. You should raise a little bit wider if people will defend tighter. Yeah, I mean, if people defend tighter, raise wider. If people don't 3-bet enough, raise wider. If people don't call enough, raise wider. Simple as that. Can I share words about GG Poker's issue with some hand? I don't know anything about GG Poker's issue with some hand. I try to stay out of the drama. This is not a drama story. This is not a drama channel. There are other channels for that. I don't know anything about any of that. All right. Notice here now, we're actually min raising from the button with a lot of suited hands. King 3 suited, Queen 4 suited, Jack 5 suited are at the bottom of the range. A lot of people never, ever, ever raise Jack 5 suited. They look at it, they think it's awful, and then they fold. It's probably too tight. Like Louis Philippe just said here, official poker coaching study group, you should probably raise even a little bit wider than this chart recommends, and I agree. I mean, notice 6-5 suited is folding. Notice 5-4 suited is folding. I'd probably be raising those. I'd probably be raising King 2 suited. I'd be raising like King 7 offsuit. I think that's fine. One thing you will notice, by the way, is that GTO definitely errs towards big cards compared to suited, connected, playable hands that are low when you're playing very, very shallow stacked. Let's just look at the 80 big blind chart, for example. Take a snapshot of this in your mind, the hands that are played. Notice 6-5 suited, 5-4 suited, 7-6 suited don't play 15 big blinds deep. But we see like 6-3 suited playing and 10-2 suited playing 80 big blinds deep. So you see a very different selection of hands gets to be played as you're playing deeper stacked. You get to play way wider when you're deeper stacked. When we raise, how much are we raising? A raise is a minimum raise. Definitely not a pot size raise. That would be a blunder. Because when you're 15 big blinds deep, imagine you make it 3.5 or 4.5 big blinds, whatever the number is. If you make it 4.5 big blinds and then somebody shoves, you now have to put in a 10.5 to try to win 31. So you need to win 33% of the time, give or take, which you will. And that's really bad. It means you have to call off of basically everything. So instead, in this scenario, you're going to be min raising. This is when everyone folds to you. Just to be perfectly clear, we are not making a pot size raise. You cannot be making pot size raises when you're playing 15 big blinds deep pre-flop. You're going to torch your money. Minimum raise, 2 big blinds. I wrote this in my very first poker book 15 years ago. Hopefully everybody knows this by now. When they fold to you, 15 big blinds deep, you're either shoving or you're min raising. Okay? Because you want to be able to raise a hand like Queen 4 suited and then fold if they shove on you. But if they, if you make it 3.5 or 4.5 big blinds, and then someone shoves on you, you have to call it off with Queen 4 suited, which is terrible, right? So anyway, this is what we're doing on the button. Okay, we've gone through all these spots here. Let's take a look now at small blind strategy. Okay, this is where it gets really different. Now, if they fold to you in the small blind, this is where a lot of live cash game players go horribly wrong. They have no clue what to do because they think you're supposed to chop and move on to the next hand. This is where a lot of tournament players either shove or fold, which is also a disaster. This is where a lot of tournament players raise to 3 big blinds out of their 15 big blind stack, which, as you can see here, is a disaster. Here's the GTO strategy. You are all in with the hands in red, and you're limping the hands in green. Now, why would we possibly want to have a limping range from the small blind? Take a second, think about it. You can figure it out. You all are smart. When do we start min raising? What stack depth? 30 big blinds, 40 big blinds. Depends on how bad the opponents play. If with 15 big blinds at the shortest stack at the table, can you use this strategy? This is exactly the strategy you should be using 15 big blinds deep. What's your total profit subtracting your buy-ins? You know, fortunately for you, it's really easy to do math. You can figure this kind of thing out. It's about $3.5 million, though, give or take. Not a ton. Not too little. Decent amount. All right. Take a look at this. Why would we want to have a wide limping range? Well, it's all, poker at the end of the day is all about equity realization. Poker is about equity realization. You want to realize all of the equity in the pot that is owed to you. Now, whenever you're in the small blind, you have to put in half a big blind to try to win the small blind, the big blind, and the ante. So you're putting in half a big blind to try to win 6 big blinds total. That means you need to realize about 18% equity. Now, which hands on this chart can realize about 18% equity? Out of position. Well, almost all of them. That's the answer. Almost every hand against a random hand is going to realize 18% equity or more. Now, the problem with just limping all of your garbage to hope to try to see the flop is that then you become very, very easy to play against. So, you have to make sure you limp with some good hands. And if you take a look at this chart, you are actually limping with a wide range of very good hands. They can easily limp and then call a shove. Because you have to realize when you limp, the big blind is going to shove a decent amount of the time. So, we see pocket 7s and better does a lot of limping. All the good big suited hands do a lot of limping. Ace-X suited does a lot of limping. These are all hands that can easily limp and then call off. Why are the suited aces limping but the off-suited hands shoving? It's because the suited aces can play better post-flop if you limp and see the flop. You'll find that whenever you're going to frequently see the flop, you'd much rather have suited hands than offsuit hands. Notice that the shoving range here is consisting of entirely hands that don't flop especially well. We have all the Ace-X offsuit. We have lots of King-X offsuit. We have some Queen-X offsuit. We have a lot of suited connected type hands and small pairs. All these hands are almost always good and or realize good equity, but they're going to have a tough time playing post-flop. Okay? By the way, you may ask, what do we do if the big blind shoves? Well, we have a chart for that. You can click on right up here. I'll show you how to do it. You click on big blind versus limp from small blind. And here's what the big blind should actually do in this scenario. If the small blind's playing perfectly, big blind should actually shove only a lot of bad ace-X, king-X offsuit, funny enough, for 15 big blinds. They should also shove small pairs, and then they should raise small to 3 big blinds with all the best hands, and then a smattering of absolute trash. Do your opponents raise over your small blind limp with a smattering of trash? Ask yourself that. If you limp, are they really raising with 10-3 offsuit, 9-3 offsuit, 7-2 offsuit? The answer is no. The answer is no. So, if that's the case, you in turn should actually limp more often from the small blind than my charts just recommended, because they are not going to raise your limp often enough. Now, to be fair, they may raise with a wider range of value hands, like you give them Queen-Jack suited or King-10 offsuit, maybe they raise. So that is definitely worth noting. Oh, my bad. I said 0.5 to win 6. I'm sorry. 0.5 to win 3. You're putting in 1 unit to win 6. That's my fault. That's my fault. That's my fault. 0.5 units to win 3 units. You got me on that one. Whenever I talk a million miles a second, it gets difficult for me to get everything correct. I apologize. That's what happens in a live show. No editing, one take only, live. You don't find very many people tackle topics like this live because it's easy to screw up. And I appreciate all of you catching me when I screw up. Fortunately, only one screw up in the first 29 minutes. What can you do? All right. So this is what the big blind should actually do against the small blind limp. And you see, most people don't do this. Take a second, though, and think about what should you actually do if your small blind opponent raises or shoves with more good hands. What should you do if your opponent is going to use this exact same range, but change the way they play it? Imagine they raise small with like 9s and better, ace-jack suited and better, and maybe like some ace-x suited and a little bit of trash. What should you do instead as the big blind if your opponent does that? Could you imagine any other poker content creator tackling somewhat intricate topics like this live? It would be a mess. There's only a few who can do it, and they work as coaches at pokercoaching.com. All right. Element asked me literally the same question. He must have been sleeping already. It's tough whenever you answer the question and they're sleeping and they're already answering a question that's kind of asinine anyway. Only 3.5, bro. Sorry. Sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down. Depends on if you win your 100Ks. So, if your opponent is going to have a limping range that is proportionally weaker than this limping range, you in turn should be raising way more frequently. Perhaps shoving way more frequently because you really don't want to raise a limp and have them call with something like queen nine offsuit. You'd much rather jam and have them fold. Now take a look at this chart here. We have raise small blind versus raise from big blind. Okay, so this is when small blind limps. You limp small blind. Big blind raises to 3 big blinds. What should you then do? Take a look at this chart. You may ask, why don't we have ace queen? Well, because you would have open shoved it pre-flop. Same thing with ace 4. Why don't we have all the bad hands? Well, we folded them pre-flop. So now what we do is we now shove over the limp with lots of ace x suiteds. I'm sorry, we now shove over the raise. See, caught me again. 2 errors in 32 minutes. You shove over the raise with a lot of ace x suiteds. Ace, king, queen, king, jack suited. 10s, 9s, 8s, 7s. And then you also shove with a smattering of suited high card blocker hands. King 5, king 4, king 3, king 2, queen 4, queen 3, queen 2, jack 4, jack 3, jack 2. And 10-4 suited for fun. If you want to sprinkle in a king 3 offsuit, feel free. You're jamming these over the 3 big blind raise if your opponent plays well. But what if your opponent raises with a more linear range? What if they don't raise the 7-2 offsuit and the 8-3 offsuit? Well, you should obviously have fewer bluffs, right? You should have fewer bluffs here. You should probably not shove quite as many hands in this vicinity. Really, a lot of the mixed frequency hands, you should probably just call or fold instead. And you should definitely not be calling quite as wide with the really junky hands like queen 5 offsuit, 7-6 offsuit, 10-7 offsuit. You should be folding these hands instead because you're going to be way more dominated by a good, strong linear raising range over a limp. I know it's kind of difficult to keep all these ranges in your mind, but this is how you do need to learn to think about poker, right? You want to ask, what does my opponent do incorrectly compared to GTO, and then how would I go about adjusting GTO to account for it? Also, notice, whenever you limp small blind and big blind raises to 3 big blinds, and you have pocket jacks, or queens, or kings, or aces, you should just call from a GTO point of view. Maybe a little bit surprising to you. Why wouldn't you just shove? Don't you want to win the pot? The answer is no. You want to stack your opponent. These hands are so good to the point that you are willing to call, let your opponents have some equity realization in exchange for getting a continuation back out of them on the flop. Notice, this also allows you to call a little bit wider because your post-flop range is going to be a little bit more well protected. Because if you just have aces and kings and queens and jacks in your range, then in this scenario, you get to call with more junk, which lets you realize your equity more with your junk. If your range did not contain the 4 best hands, you're going to end up having to check fold more often on the flop, which is going to result in you not being able to realize your equity as well. So you're going to find that very often with shallow stacks, the best hands do a pretty good amount of slow playing. Okay? What do we do against the big blind all in? Now, remember, the big blind's not actually going... what am I doing? Big blind's not actually going all in all that often. Do I have this chart? Small blind versus... I don't know. Chart's not coming up. Well, whatever. We'll look at the spot. The answer is call off with your best hands, fold all the garbage. All right. Now that we have looked at what to do versus whenever you initially limp, let's talk about what you do versus a raise, okay? So we're going to look at under the gun +1 versus a raise. Under the gun raises, 8-handed. You are under the gun +1. Second act. Okay? In the spot, when under the gun raises, what should you do? Well, the answer is you should shove or fold. Hands in red, go all in. Hands in blue, fold. Easy. Who in the high rollers would use a looser or tighter players as an example for GTO adjustments? I mean, the thing is almost no players in the high rollers are too tight. Most of them are too loose. And the ones that are too tight, they're not actually too tight. They may seem tight, but they're not. I mean, there's some players like... I thought Seth Davies was too tight for a while, and maybe he was, but you play with him in tournaments, and, you know, he'll show up with the hands that he should. He's just playing good, strong GTO poker. Maybe the 20 times I played with him before, he just had a bad run of cards, and therefore looked like he was playing too tight, right? Players like Michael Adamo clearly play a wider range. I think Mikita Badzikowski clearly plays a wider range. And you have to adjust accordingly, right? They think probably people don't respond with quite enough aggression, which I think is actually kind of right. So they get after it a little bit. They think people overfold. They get after it a little bit, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, most players who are very good in the high stakes world Play roughly GTO ranges pre-flop because you really can't get too far off of them unless your opponents are doing something really wrong. All right, so take a look at this chart. Narco says, you can't believe we're shoving King 10 suited against the under-the-gun min-raise. So it is worth noting, as Louis Philippe says in the chat, that the hands that are using mixed frequencies are basically break-even / barely profitable. So that kind of also implies hands that are on the cusp of playability. And if you see, where is the cusp of this chart? Well, King 10 suited is on the cusp, right? This is a scenario where, yeah, I mean, it's probably very close to break-even. And if your opponents are not raising quite enough pre-flop, then you, in turn, should shove a little bit tighter. You may be surprised the ace-jack offsuit just folds in this spot a lot of the time. If you think your opponents are playing a little bit too tight pre-flop, ace-jack offsuit's definitely a fold. Notice, very importantly, there are no calls. There are no calls. If you have jack 10 suited, 10-9 suited, pocket 6s, pocket 4s, fold, fold. You have 10-9 suited, 9-8 suited. These are hands that are just folds. In this scenario, 15 big blinds deep. What if we were, let's say, 25 big blinds deep? Do you start having calls then? Yes, because now we have almost no shoves. We're too deep to shove in this spot. And that's going to allow us to call with hands that make logical calls, like the jack 10 suiteds and whatnot. If we were 80 big blinds deep, you're going to see, you know, still a tight strategy, but we get to have some calls as well. But 15 big blinds deep, in these scenarios, you're just doing a whole lot of shoving or folding. Voorhees also points out king-queen offsuit, a hand that's thought to be pretty good, just folds. Now, you can kind of extrapolate from this and think, how do my opponents actually play? And what should I do? Look at what under the gun actually should do. Does your opponent raise this wide? Ask yourself that. Simple as this. Does your opponent raise this wide? Some people do, some people don't. If you know the GTO range here, that this is what your opponent's supposed to do, and they play tighter than this, then you in turn must play tighter under the gun +1. Seems obvious, right? If they play wider than this, say they do what I recommended, raise every ace-x suited, raise all the king-x, or raise all the hands that are using mixed frequencies, you in turn should shove a little bit wider. Okay? And that's essentially how it works. So if your opponents are going to be playing tighter than this, as a lot of people do, then you in turn have to shove a little bit tighter. So ace-jack offsuit's just going to fold for sure. Maybe even 7s and 5s fold, and king 10 suited. I think those are all fine to fold. Queen-jack suited may be fine to fold if they're playing a little too tight. Okay? What about cutoff versus a raise from under the gun +1? Remember, under the gun +1 should still be pretty tight. Notice now, very similar strategy, but slightly wider. Why is it slightly wider? Well, there's two clear reasons. First, under the gun +1 should raise a little bit wider than under the gun, right? And you are now in later position in the cutoff. Cutoff is the seat to the right of the button. So now, instead of shoving when you're under the gun +1 into low jack, high jack, etc., that's 6 people, you're now shoving into only 3 additional people, and that allows you to shove wider, right? So, essentially, as your position gets later and later, you get to shove wider and wider. So let's take a look at button versus under the gun +1. So notice here, cutoff shoves 10%. Obviously, button's going to shove some amount wider, or at least play some amount wider. The question is how much wider. Funny enough, this was a bad example. The button gets to call some. Button's the one of the positions where you get to start calling. So let's actually now talk about that. Let's look at low jack first. Low jack versus under the gun raise. You're shoving 9%. And the hijack, you're shoving 9.6%. And the cutoff, you're shoving 10.4%, right? Against the same range as raise. But the fact that you have fewer people you have to act lets you shove a little bit wider. Let's look at let's look at cutoff versus, let's say, hijack seat. You're going to be shoving very wide now. Well, at least much wider, right? Not super wide, but still wider. So now we see like jack 10 suited, pocket 5s, ace 10 offsuit, ace 5 suited, ripping it in over the raises. So as it gets to be like late position versus late position battles, you start to shove more. But again, I want to make it really clear here. In the cutoff, you don't have a calling range. In no position until you get to the button do you have a calling range against a raise 15 big blinds deep. What's your default strategy when you don't have any info on your opponents? Do you assume they are playing correctly until proven otherwise? No, not at all. But if I'm playing against good, strong opponents in a medium or high stakes game, I don't necessarily know what they do wrong. So yeah, I just play Gto strategies. This is not me presuming they play well. This is me presuming I don't know what they do wrong. And those are very different things, right? Now, if you go to a small stakes game and you show up to a table and you see, let's say, let's pick on the old guy today. You see an old guy sitting there in a business suit. His chips are stacked very neatly as if he has arranged them and not touched them for a while. That's probably a tight player. Probably. So I'm going to presume when that player raises under the gun, even if it's my first hand at the table and I've seen nothing, he's probably raising tighter than the GTO range. Because it takes a lot of effort to arrange all of your chips. And especially if that player has no like anti-chips, back when there was an anti-chip in play where everybody antied. I know that's a relic of the past now, but a number of anti-chips someone used to have or had was a very clear sign of aggression or non-aggression. So you could use things like that to see. All right. So again, I want to make it really clear. 15 big blinds deep, you have no calling range. Obviously, 12 big blinds, 10 big blinds, same thing. You have no calling range when you get about 15 big blinds or shallower. Let's look at 20 big blinds. Do we have a calling range here? We do. So notice, 20 big blinds deep, it changes. You get to actually start calling a lot, cutoff versus a hijack. Let's take a look at the earlier positions, 20 big blinds deep. Under the gun +1 versus a raise from under the gun. I think it's still going to have calls. Yeah, so it does still have calls, but some shoves. And again, get the charts at pokercoaching.com. They're very clearly in the tools section, also in the app. Go through these spots over and over and over and over and over again until you roughly know what to do in these spots. And, if possible, reference these charts as much as you can without breaking any terms and conditions of your site or casino that you are playing in. So as you see, you do have calls when you're playing 20 big blinds deep. Now, there's obviously some number between 15 and 20 where there's the strategy changes, right? I think it's something like 17-ish big blinds, 18-ish big blinds. But if you're like at 16 big blinds, use the 15 big blind charts, you'll be fine. If you're at 18, use the 20 big blind charts, you'll be fine, right? So don't get too nitpicky where, oh my God, I don't have exactly 18.6 big blind charts. What do I do? You got to use some common sense, everybody. You have to be a little bit loose and fluid in these scenarios. All right, back to 15 big blind charts. Notice, okay, so we have a rule in our head now, right? That you should all know. 15 big blinds deep against a raise. If you're any position cut off or earlier, you're shoving or folding. Fine. What do we do when we are on the button? Button versus raise from under the gun. You will have some shoves, but also some calls. Button gets to have calls in this scenario. Which hands like to call? Well, one thing you'll see very clearly is that pocket aces calls basically every time. You may be surprised to see that. Pocket king slow plays some as well. And that allows you to then call with a slightly wider range of playable hands. Which hands have the best playability? It's going to be good, strong, big cards that are not quite good enough to shove, and good, strong, suited, connected hands that are not quite good enough to shove. Perhaps also some small pairs. So we see here, ace-X suited, the best ones call. King-Jack suited, King-10 suited, Queen-Jack suited, Queen-10 suited. You know, good, strong, suited connectors call. 6s and 5s call. Sometimes shove, obviously. King-Queen offsuit calls. If we see ace-10 offsuit calling sometimes, I would just fold this probably. One issue you have with these charts is that you think they should change based on average chip stack. If average chip stack is 50 versus 5, the chart should be completely different. Are you missing something? Quite possibly you're missing something. What matters is how is your stack relevant and relative to the other stacks yet to act. Okay? How does your stack matter compared to the stacks yet to act at the table? It doesn't really matter if the average chip stack in the tournament is 50 big blinds if everybody yet to act in your scenario has 15. You're playing 15 big blind poker. Simple as that. If average chip stack is 5 big blinds in the tournament, there are no payout implications, which, you know, there probably are if the average stack is 5 big blinds. But in that scenario, then it shouldn't matter, right? So you can use a little bit of common sense and figure out when it matters and when it doesn't matter. All right, so button versus under the gun raise. As you see, some shoves and some calls, right? You see here, 7.8% shoves, 5% calls. And it makes sense which hands are shoving in these scenarios, right? What about against under the gun +1? What happens? Well, obviously, we're going to do a little bit more shoving and a little bit less calling. What about low jack? little bit more shoving, roughly the same amount of calling. So now we're starting to shove with just good, more good, strong, better hands. Hijack seat, roughly similar strategy, more ace-x suited and small pairs starting to rip it in now. Once your opponent's raise comes from later and later position, they're not going to start having just more junk in their range, which is going to result in you shoving more. And then button versus cutoff. You see we do still have a bit of a calling range, but now a lot of shoves. A lot of shoves, because we're against the widest range we will be against. Okay? So, if you take a look at the hands that call very frequently in these scenarios, it's going to be hands that are not quite good enough to shove, but still do okay. That's going to be mostly some ace-x suited that are not quite good enough to shove, good, strong, big suited cards that are not quite good enough to shove, and small pairs that are not quite good enough to shove. And some one or two offsuit hands that are not quite good enough to shove. I mean, take a look. You'll see this pattern holding very true. Stuff like king, queen, king, jack, queen, jack are usually the calls for offsuits. King 9, queen 9, jack 9, 10, 9, 9, 8 suited are mostly the suited hands. Ace 8, ace 7, ace 6 are mostly the ace-x suited, and a few small pairs. Plus pocket aces. Notice aces, slow plays literally every time. Okay? Now, you should hopefully know how to play the button in these spots. Easy! All right, what about small blind? Small blind's an interesting spot. Small blind versus raise from under the gun +1. You should actually have a decently wide calling range, which almost no one does. This is a spot where a lot of people screw up. What they do wrong is they shove or fold everything. And you should have a decently wide shoving range, but notice, small blind against an under the gun +1 raise, you actually get to call a lot. Why do you get to call a lot? Because you are not putting in the entire amount of money, right? So you want to make sure that since you know you're going to see a three-way pot a lot of the time, because big blinds has to put in one to then win a bunch, you want to make sure the hands you're playing have very good post-flop playability. And you see GTO here, the only hands that kind of lack post-flop playability are king, queen offsuit, king, jack offsuit, and queen, jack offsuit. And even then, those are fine, right? And then just a bunch of suited connected stuff. Ace-x suited, pocket ace is still slow plays a lot. Shoving, though, with the best hands, just a good, strong linear range of a lot of your best hands. Okay? Very common scenario, you'll see the shoving range becomes very, very strong and linear. You'll see this kind of like upward arrow-looking shape is what's shoving, and stuff that's not quite good enough to shove is calling. What about in the hijack seat? Now you're going to be shoving more because the hijack's raising range is weaker, right? You do still have some calls. In this scenario, whenever you start to look at a GTO chart like this, you may just want to ignore the calling range and just shove it. Just shove it all. You'll be shoving a little bit too often, but I think it's fine. Small blind against button will have no calling range now because that's when the opponent's range is going to be the widest. So we start to shove very wide, again, with this very strong arrow type range. Okay? So in the small blind, you really only have a calling range against the earlier positions. So like hijack, low jack, under the gun +1, and under the gun. That's where you're going to have a calling range a lot because those ranges should be raising with a good, strong range, right? Seems weird to have a calling range 15 big blinds deep with 8-7 suited for post-flop playability when you're deep enough for only maybe one street. We got to realize, if you make a pair, you're good to go. So it's not like we are... It's not like we are calling and trying to check fold anything if we make a pair. So this is a spot where you have to realize... I mean, again, poker is all about equity realization. Can you put in 1.5 big blinds to try to win their 2, the big blind, the ante, your 2. So essentially, can you put in 1.5 to try to win, how much is this? 6. Can you realize 25% equity out of position with 8-7 suited against the strong under the gun raising range? 15 big blinds deep, the answer is obviously yes, because you can see the flop and go from there. Make a pair, don't fold. Appreciate all of you saying that you enjoy the show. If you enjoy the show, do me a favor, click the like and subscribe button. I would appreciate it. So we see we have a calling range against the earlier positions, but almost no calling range against the later positions when we're playing 15 big blinds deep, because whenever they are in later and later position, their range gets wider and wider, and that gives us more pre-flop fold equity. By the way, some of you are confused about what's allowed and what's not allowed. Are these charts considered real-time assistance when you're playing online? No, but most major sites have banned pre-flop charts. Are these pre-flop charts? Absolutely. These are actually good pre-flop charts. So yeah, on some sites, especially if you win on them, they may get after you. So please, please, please do not use the charts when you're playing on an online poker site that has made it very clear that pre-flop charts are not allowed. Okay? Don't poop where you eat. I learned that one a long time ago. And don't poop where you eat. And to be fair, don't poop anywhere. Turns out if you don't poop anywhere, there's nothing to clean up. All right, let's take a look at big blind strategies. Big blind versus raise from under the gun. You're going to do... What am I doing here? Clicking on the wrong buttons is what I'm doing. Big blind versus raise from under the gun. Here we go. A lot of calling. You're going to find that this arrow, you know, where you're shoving a lot of the best hands and calling a lot of everything else is going to often look pretty similar as from the small blind, but your calling range is going to be incredibly wide. Your calling range can be very, very wide in the spot because you're getting really good odds. Again, you have to put in one big blind to try to win their two. Big blind, ante, and half from a small blind. You have to put in one to try to win 4.5. Pretty good odds. Can you realize 20% equity out of position, or whatever it is, 22% equity out of position? The answer is yes, especially closing the action. Now, you may notice the small blind range was much tighter to call, getting roughly the same odds, and that's because they're not closing the action. The big blind's going to shove sometimes, and the big blind's going to call sometimes and make it three ways, which takes away a lot of the small blind's equity. Here, though, you're closing the action, and it's heads up, so you don't have to worry about any of that, and that lets you call substantially wider. Now, I will say that this chart presumes you play perfectly post-flop. I'm not going to play perfectly post-flop, and you probably aren't either. So a lot of these hands at the very bottom of playability, especially the offsuit hands, I think it's fine to fold them. Like Queen 3 offsuit, 6 3 offsuit, 5 3 offsuit, 7 4 offsuit, 4 3 offsuit. I think it's fine to fold. Now, I would not fold any suited hand, but I think it's fine to fold out the absolute worst hands on this chart. It's also worth noting, if there are payout implications happening right now, you will almost certainly defend tighter if you are the one with the payout implications hurting you, making you play tighter. So a lot of these suited hands will start folding out against the min raise if there are payout implications, and a lot of these offsuit hands will start folding out if there are payout implications as well. Also, you'll be shoving more quite often. All right, so anyway, which hands are shoving? A lot of pairs and ace-x suiteds, okay? What about against under the gun +1? You will shove a little bit wider, call a little bit wider. Look at the fold percentage here. Fold percentage here is important, and all-in percentage here is important. So let's see. Against under the gun, we are folding 22.5 and shoving 8. Against under the gun +1, we're shoving a little bit more, up to 9.7, and we are folding 22, so a little bit less. Against low jack, folding even a little bit less. Or is that roughly the same? Roughly the same. Shoving more, though. Starting to shove more against low jack. Hijack, similar story, shoving a little bit more. Basically, our calling range is staying somewhat similar, but our shoving range is getting wider within that calling range. The calling range, I'm saying this wrong. The bottom of the calling range, there it goes. The bottom of the calling range is staying similar across the board in all these charts, but the shoving range is getting wider within your overall calling range, right? So you see you're folding right at around 22, 23 something percent the entire time, but your shoving range is increasing as we get later and later. So we go earlier, it gets tighter and tighter and tighter, later and later and later, the shoving range gets wider and wider and wider. The shoving range often expands to contain more pairs and more ace-x offsuit, and more ace-x suiteds and some king-x suiteds every once in a while. Okay? It's usually what happens in these spots. So we see big blind versus a button raise. We do a whole lot of calling, but we are shoving a decent chunk of the time. In this spot, if you told me you wanted to shove like every ace-x offsuit, I think it's fine. You'll realize, if you look at a lot of your hand histories after the fact, this spot right here is a really common one. This exact spot is very common. 15 big blinds deep, folds to the button, they min raise. What do? You should know without having looking at it, queens and lower shoves, all the ace-x shoves, king 5, king 4, and king 5, king 4, and king 3 shove, and then a decent chunk of the ace-x suited shove. Easy. Also king, queen, and queen jack. And if you do that, you will be fine and good. Simple as that. But you need to study the spot and know it. And what a lot of people do wrong here is they don't shove queen jack, they don't shove king jack, they don't shove all the ace-x, or they shove all the ace-x every time, which also may be a little bit of a leak. Then they definitely don't shove king 5, king 4, and king 3 suiteds. A lot of people don't shove these, and that's probably a bit of a mistake, right? But if you are playing against good, strong opponents, you want to make sure you're playing good, strong strategies. Let's look at big blind versus raise from small blind. Big blind versus raise. Oh, small blind doesn't have a raising range. Remember, they limp or they shove, so that doesn't exist. All right, let's look at versus all in. Okay, I just want to show you real quick. We'll breeze through this. 15 big blinds, under the gun +1 versus all in from under the gun. Just call your best hands. And again, if your opponents aren't shoving quite as often as GTO, you want to fold out the bottom of the range. If they are shoving tighter, if they're shoving wider than GTO, some people will only shove or fold. If they are shoving wider than GTO, you should call off a touch wider. You don't get why King 3 suited is shoving in the previous chart, but King 7 suited is call. King 7 suited is good enough to call and see the flop. King 3 suited is not. In all these spots, if you've been paying attention, a lot of the hands that are shoving that are at the bottom of the range that are shoving are hands that are good, but not quite good enough to usually call. Okay? You're shoving because it's not good enough to call. Anytime you're asking, why does this hand shove but a better hand doesn't? It's because the better hand is good enough to call. It realizes its equity better. As your hand is good, but realizes its equity worse, those are the hands that usually end up shoving. All right, under the gun, +1 versus under the gun shove. Call literally the nuts. Easy game. What about hijack versus under the gun? It's going to be similar. What about button versus under the gun? It's going to be similar. You may say, wow, why are these charts so similar? It's because against the under the gun all in, their range is not changing. It's just a good, strong nut range. So if their range is nuts, you can only really call the nuts, right? Big blind versus under the gun all in, similar. I would say that you probably don't even want to call this wide. I think that you can probably call a little bit tighter than this against under the gun shove. But notice that you're calling wider in this spot because you're closing the action and there's no one yet to act. That really is an important point here. As you're closing the action and there are fewer people yet to act, you get to call a little bit wider. Hands like King Jack suited, I would just fold in this spot. King Queen offsuit, I would just fold in this spot. What about hijack versus all in from low jack? Hijack versus low jack. You're still going to call off pretty tight. Notice, 15 big blinds deep, you just don't get to call shoves all that often. Even if you know they're not shoving hands like aces and kings, right? Remember, because those are all min raise. They're shoving a good, strong, medium range. Big suited connected type hands, big offsuit hands, some small and medium pairs, right? That's what they're shoving in this spot, ace-X suiteds. So this is what you can call in that scenario. If they're shoving a stronger range, as most people do, you in turn have to call off even tighter than this. Okay? What about hijack versus... let's go over to button versus all in from low jack seat. Again, you're calling off pretty tight. What about against cutoff seat? It'll be wider, but not that much wider. You're still calling off pretty tight. I think you can justify folding stuff like 5s and 4s here. King 10 suited, ace-9 offsuit, ace-7 suited. Hands at the bottom of the range because most people don't shove often enough. And quite often, whenever you do get down to 15 big blinds, there are some payout implications late in tournaments. So you should probably call off a little bit tighter. What about small blind versus all in from button? As you see here, pretty tight calling range, but again, it depends on what strategy they're using. This Nicola guy who's probably impersonating on my Instagram says, it's pathetic you're sending Instagram messages about people trading FTX. Obviously, there are people on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and everywhere else who impersonate me. I'm a medium famous person. If Jonathan Little ever sends you a message saying, hey, give me money for Forex trading, if you're not smart enough to see that that is someone trying to scam you, you're not going to make it. No legitimate person who is anywhere near popular or famous at all will ever message you out of the blue asking you for money. They will not do it ever. People have been impersonating Jonathan Little for 15 years. And they've scammed some people. And that sucks. But if you're not smart enough to know that people aren't going to message you on the internet without doing a FaceTime call in today's environment, even with a FaceTime call nowadays, they have all these fakes. Don't send money to people who presumably have a lot of money. That's dumb. Jonathan Little will never ask you for money besides sign up for my training site. Okay? Okay? honestly kind of pathetic anybody would come into the YouTube channel and think, even be dumb enough to think that I, Jonathan Lill, who's sitting here in front of all of you, would be recommending you to send them $5,000 for me to trade Forex for you. Okay? Do we really have to say this? Are we really that unintelligent here? I would hope all of you realize that there are people on the internet who are trying to scam you. Please don't get scammed. Don't be an idiot. Please don't be scammed. Please don't get scammed. Please don't get scammed. Please don't get scammed. Okay. Small blind versus all in from button. As we see here, again, same rough hands that are calling, right? Just call with the best hands. Big blind versus all in from button. Same rough hands, a little bit wider. This is a spot where I will start calling off a little bit wider if you think the button is going to be jamming wider for value. Or just like wider in general. A lot of people on the button will have no min-raising range, okay? If the button's gonna have no min-raising range, then you in turn should probably call wider if they're min-raising the same range. I'm sorry, if they're shoving the same range that they should be min-raising, right? So you may actually have to call wider than this. This is one of these weird spots where you may have to get after it. One other thing I wanted to show before we wrap it up real quick is, let's look at under the gun versus 3-bet all in, okay? This is where under the gun +1 raises, you raise under the gun, then somebody yet to act shoves. What do you call with? And the answer is pretty much always the best hands. So, in this spot, you raise under the gun +1, low jack rips it in 15 big blinds, they fold back to you, what do? You call with your best hands. What are your best hands? Well, in this spot, 7s and better, ace 10 suited and better, ace jack offsuit and better, and king queen suited. Just the best hands. You should not be calling off with like ace 9 offsuit, pocket 5s, king 5 suited, ace 8 5 suited, any garbage, right? Even king queen offsuit's a fold in some of these scenarios, as we're about to see, which may sound a little bit nitty. Under the gun +1 raise versus 3-bet all in from the button. Remember, you have a strong range to min raise under the gun, and they're still shoving, so they have to have something pretty good. Now we're calling off all pairs, 5s and better, all the best big cards. That's it. King queen offsuit again still folds a lot. What about versus big blind? Same rough calling range, okay? When you raise under the gun, you're calling off with roughly the same range. Do these charts include limps? No, because you should not be limping. Now, I'm sure you could develop a strategy to have shoves, min raises, limps, and folds. That we are playing no limit hold'em, but the value you get from using that additional strategy of limping is almost nothing, and it complicates your strategy substantially. Okay? Why is king 10 suited blacked out? Because you would have shoved it pre-flop. From under the gun +1, king 10 suited shoves every time. Therefore, it's no longer in your range. And you're going to see, as we move to the later positions, hands in this vicinity are often going to be blacked out because you have already shoved them. It's no longer in your range. As you see, though, I wanted to point out, you're calling with a lot of the pairs every time and all of the best big cards, and you're folding everything else when you raise from early position and get jammed. What about hijack versus 3-bet all in from cutoff? Same story. So notice here, more of these hands are completely blacked out, right? Because we don't have them anymore. So we see here, pairs call, good hands call. King, queen offsuit now calls. Just good hands call off. Hijack versus cutoff shove. What about against button shove? Same story. What about small blind shove? Same story. Slightly wider ranges. What about big blind shove? Same story. Okay? You may notice we call off actually a little bit tighter in some of these hands when we're against the big blind, because big blind should call a ton and therefore not shove as often as, let's say, the small blind, right? With 15 big blinds, you're push folding for the most part. No, have you been paying attention? 15 big blinds deep, you're not push folding for the most part, especially when you're first. What about button versus 3-bet all in from small blind? Same story, call the best hands, fold the rest. You may be surprised to see, though, that the best hands at this point do start to contain some pretty bad hands. And again, notice these hands in this vicinity and this vicinity are all not in our range because we would have shoved them pre-flop. They were good enough to shove pre-flop. What about versus the big blind? Same strategy, right? Just call off the best hands. And again, all the hands kind of at the bottom of the range, if you think your opponents are not shoving enough, should be folded. So like we see king 10 and ace 2 and ace 3 offsuit calling in this spot, button versus small blind all in, but in general, it's probably fine to fold if your opponents are not shoving quite enough. Okay? Is this pre-flop for live and online tournaments? Yes! This is for any spot where your opponents play well. Now, if your opponents play poorly, you should adjust. Like I just said, like I literally just said, if your opponents don't shove often enough, you in turn should fold the bottom of the calling range. Easy. Just fold out the bottom. What's the bottom here? Very clearly, these hands here. Interesting that sevens is not a pure shove from the button, 15 big blinds deep. Well, I mean, you can very clearly go back here and look at this. Button raise first in. And you see sevens is mostly a min raise. Sevens is a really good hand. I'm not sure if you're aware of this. Sevens is nice because when you min raise, a lot of the hands that have like 50-ish% equity just call. Well, let's look at this. Button. Let's look at small blind versus raise. I mean, small blind's going to be a bad example because small blind's going to do a lot of shoving. Small blind's going to do a lot of shoving here, right? So it's not a good example. But let's look at big blind here. As we see here, all these, like, look at the hands that are actually shoving. Do you want hands like ace-6 suited, king-3 suited, king-2 suited, jack-4 suited to shove against you? I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong chart. Button versus, God, what am I doing? Yeah, big blind versus raise from button. There we go. Yeah, so do you want king-5, king-4, and king-3 suited shoving on you? Of course you do. Do you want ace-5, ace-4, ace-3, ace-2 shoving on you when you have sevens? Of course you do. So notice that by shoving, you get all of these hands to fold, right? And you really don't want those hands to fold. You really want those hands in there against you. So sevens is enough to shove. So look, that's really it. Those are all the common spots you're going to encounter whenever you're playing 15 big blinds deep. We covered them all in about an hour and 7 minutes. Tried to get an hour, but what can you do? There's a poker coaching study session starting right now, ran by Louis Philippe. Louis Philippe and the D-Gens will get you up to speed. They're not really D-Gens. They're actually sharks. They're all very, very good. I want to thank all of you for being here with me today. Please protect yourself before you wreck yourself. I know there's a lot of people out there trying to scam people asking for money for all sorts of nonsense. You can rest assured Jonathan Little, one, or whatever, is never going to be messaging you asking for money anywhere. Unless I'm giving you a deal on poker coaching. And even then, make sure you're actually going to the correct website. Fortunately, all the scammers I haven't figured out to clone training sites yet, but they will one day. Only click on official links, etc., etc., etc. Okay? Protect yourself before you wreck yourself, friends. Don't give away your money to scammers. Good luck in your games. Have fun. Make the most of your opportunities. I'm happy to get out to Vegas. I'll be out to Vegas in just a few days. We'll get in the World Series of Poker, start the grind, and maybe win a bracelet. Or maybe not. Either way, I'll have fun. If you see me out there, say hello, please. We have a few meetups for poker coaching premium members. Make sure you get into those. And that's it. I'll talk to all of you later. I love you all. Run hot. Goodbye.